Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar on the Colorado Model Electric Ready and Solar Ready Code for commercial buildings. Today the webinar will be recorded and the recordings posted to the Code Adoption Toolkit within the next week or so. So if you don't see it there and you're looking for it, just let me know. My name is Erica DeLello. I'm project manager for NORESCO. This series is sponsored by the Colorado Energy Office with training materials created by Shums Coda Associates. So Hope and I have been working with the Colorado Energy Office to provide trainings, just like this one. So this is the second webinar in our series for over the next year. And so if you are interested in any of the following ones that I've got posted here, please go ahead and make sure you attend those. I know, Hope, you've also got some Excel webinars as well. If you want to post the link in the chat for people to register to those, to get as many opportunities as possible for trainings. Then there's also the option for a group training. So we do trainings all throughout the state on anything related to the energy code, any topic. So we can tailor certain topics to your group. It can go in person, do a virtual training. It can be as simple as like an hour training, or it can go up to 4 hours. Or, we'll work with you to find the appropriate training for your group. So feel free to reach out to me if you guys want to set something up. If you have a topic you want to hear more about, I'm available. My email address is on the screen right now, and you guys have probably received emails from me in the past. So we've got the Code Adoption Toolkit, which I talk about every time we've got a webinar here, and we've got a whole bunch of different resources and available on there in addition to all the previous recordings. I will say that so a lot of this stuff is going to be updated as well. So we've got like 2021 versions on there for now. And then as soon as the 2024 comes out, whenever that'll be, maybe Q2 of next year, I'll get some of those resources updated for code comparisons from between the 2021 and 2024 as well. So we'll keep you all posted on that. But today, as always, I want to highlight the Colorado Codes helpline. So this helpline is available to anyone in Colorado on any of the I codes or reach codes. So for example, if you're a jurisdiction and need assistance on a plan review, or if you're a homeowner or an engineer, architect with a question about code applicability, you can submit a ticket and a subject matter expert will get back to you in just a few days' time. And so you can access the helpline through this QR code or the link. It's also in the Code Adoption Toolkit. So, and a link there. So submit your questions. We're here to help. And so for today's presentation, we do want to encourage questions throughout. So if you've got a question that you want to ask Hope about or myself, you can go ahead and either raise your hand or write it in the Q&A function. And before we continue with the presentation, we'll address that question at that point, because as Hope presents, some of this material is rather new to you all. We want to make sure that we're clarifying everything up front for you guys. So there's room within the presentation for us to address as many questions as you guys need. And so lastly, there will be a survey window that pops up following the webinar. If you could just take a minute to provide feedback so we can continue to improve on these webinars, that would be great. So with that, today's presenter is Hope Medina, and she's an energy and sustainability consultant from Shums Coda Associates. She's worked on a national level and as well as local to assist on energy and green codes. She's a governing member of the ICC, Sustainability Membership Council, Consensus Committee member, and a task group chair of the National Green Building Standard for several cycles. And I see that Denise has her hand up, so I'm going to go ahead and allow you to talk. If you could unmute yourself. Denise, you need to unmute yourself first before beginning your question. All right, we're not hearing anything on your end, but if you would like to write something in the chat or in the Q&A, we're happy to address those. But for now, we'll continue, and Hope, I'll let you take it from here.
Perfect. So today, as Erica mentioned, we are going to discuss the newly created Colorado Model Electric Ready and Solar Ready Code. And we're going to look at what the commercial provisions are. Now, we know that this kind of came about for, quite a few reasons. I hear often, why are we looking at this? Why is there something along these lines that now we have to address? And part of this all came into play because we had House Bill 1362 that did require for this type of language to be developed. If you recall, in the bill itself, it referred to it as the Model Electric Code. And I think all of us in the code world all said, thank you for changing it to the Colorado Model Electric Ready and Solar Ready Code, as opposed to the Model Electric Code, because there was an awful lot of confusion that happened as to whether we're talking the National Electric Code, right? The NEC, the actual electrical provisions we follow, or this bill that was being developed. So that was one of the nice clarifying features of this. The other thing that this bill and the intent of this is really to try to future-proof some of our construction in a few areas that basically kind of how the pendulum is swinging is really heading in that particular direction. And so we're looking at it more of a, what can we do to help those that are wanting to go in this direction in the future? So with that being said, I can sit here and tell you all it is, and I think it's always really beneficial to be able to find that information. Now, and Erica, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that there may be a direction from the toolkit that does take you to this language. I may be incorrect about that, but if not, the actual web page is listed on the screen, and we'd be happy to send it out to anybody so that you can have fun taking a look at this. Now, as how this code was developed is we now have that Colorado Energy Code Board, and the Colorado Energy Code Board is charged with a few items of responsibility. One of those was developing code language that addressed several components, one being electrification ready, one being solar ready, and then also electric vehicle charging requirements. So that is what this particular language did address. And what they did is they took representatives of many aspects that you would find within Colorado. The municipalities themselves, code officials were involved, architects were involved, contractors were involved, so that there was a very strong representation on this board to help make sure that things were looked at and were in balance and doable too, right? That's one of the things as code officials, anybody who works within the codes, really does desire is whatever that code language is it doable? And so that was part of the process. And then they did also have a consultant take a look at the code language also and try to make sure that there wasn't anything that would be in conflict of already existing I-codes and the NEC itself, so that we're still all in harmony with each other. So speaking of harmony with the other I-codes, this particular language is set up very, very similarly to what we would find in if we picked up the, the plumbing code. We have chapter 1, which is the admin, and that lets us know when does this new language come into play? How do you address certain items? And we'll walk through some of that. Our chapter 2 is our definitions, right? It lets us know, hey, we're defining this as XYZ, and it allows us to move forward just like how we would with any of the other codes. Now, then the later chapters, it does dive into the very specific requirements and of the code language itself. Sorry, I just saw a whole bunch of questions pop up, so I'm not sure if there were some.
No,
okay.
No
All
question. Right. Yeah, we're good. Thank you.
Okay, they just kept popping up like crazy, and I thought, oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm just chatting away over here.
Perfect, perfect. All right. So let's dive into the actual language that you guys are all here to talk about. So as you can see on the screen, it is, again, something that we are very, very familiar with, right? We have the title because this is a document that when you adopt a newer code now, anytime you adopt a building code after July 1st of this year, you are also required to adopt this language. So in making sure that it coincides with all of the other adoption and ordinance requirements, it does have, number 1 or the 101.1 that does talk about we are adopting this and the name of the jurisdiction, which is something we see in all of the codes. It gives us our scope as to what this is about, what this particular code language is about, the intent of this, the applicability, right? Which I think is incredibly important, because where it lists here is where in any specific case, different sections of this code specify different materials, methods of construction, or other requirements, the most restrictive shall govern. A language that we're very, very familiar with. And then if we continue on, it says, where there is a conflict between a general requirement and a specific requirement, the specific requirement shall govern. And I think this is probably going to come into play a little bit in the discussion we'll have a little bit later. But I want to bring your attention to 101.4.1 and 101.4.2. I know a lot of times these particular concepts are associated with the energy code. So often when we think about the energy code, how does the energy code determine a residential building, and how does the energy code determine a commercial building? Anybody want to raise your hand and be brave and answer that? Okay, so in the energy code, it considers a residential building to be a single family, 2-family, townhomes, and then it also includes R2s, R3s, and R4s that are 3 stories or less. And then the definition of how you're defining a commercial building is any other project that doesn't fall under the categories to be considered as a residential building. Now, I'll tell you that this was a discussion that was very heavily talked about within that board, the Energy Code Board, as to how are we going to address that. And as you can see on the screen, it states that the residential buildings have to comply with the residential provisions of this code, and commercial buildings need to comply with the commercial component of this code. So if we take a look at how it's defined through this new language, it tells us that for residential buildings, we're only talking about that 1 and 2 family dwellings and townhouses. That's it. So it's basically, if you are a residential building and you are building out of the IRC, now, of course, we always have the option of the IBC, but if, you know, you have the option to build out of the IRC, per this code, you are considered to be a residential building. Now, if you are anything that you would basically not be, you know, building out of the IBC, you are going to be a commercial building. And that does include the R occupancies that are within the IBC. So basically, you build out of the IBC, you're following the commercial provisions of this code. You build out of the IRC, you're going to follow the residential provisions of this code. So I hope that makes sense to everyone. It does not follow the requirements or the specifications that the energy code does. It's IBC, IRC, basically. Now, just like all of the codes, it lists some very specific information that must be placed on the construction documents. And it does talk about that whatever is placed on those construction documents also has to be very clear as far as that they're going to meet, one, the requirements that we're going to talk about. It's very easy to decipher really what's going on. And so for that, it's broken up into basic categories. The first 3 that you see there are dealing with the solar ready zone requirements. And I put them in different colors so that you could see the distinction between them. So the purple is our solar ready, right? We need to know the location and the size of the solar zone, the structural loads, pathways of routing, things that would make sense. So as a plans examiner, you can look at it and say, oh, that's exactly what I need to say. Hey, this complies. And then the contractor knows exactly what they need to pay attention to and do. And then of course the inspector knows what they, you know, need to go out and inspect for. And then we have our pink, which is giving us the information of what we need for our EV charging. Now, if you notice, I also have that the EV also is part of new legislation that was passed. So as of March of next year, if you are an R2, and you will be required to comply with the provisions of this code. Now, here's where it kind of gets a little tricky, and I don't want to confuse things really, but basically, even if you haven't adopted this, but you are an R2 and you're building after March 1st, you will still have to comply with the EV charging provisions that you find within here. Not getting into that much more, but just want to make sure you are aware of that. And then, of course, our blue is dealing with our electric ready provisions. So it starts off with our electric ready provisions. And so basically, I want to talk about kind of the concepts because there's a lot of terminology that's thrown out there when you start talking about electrification and all that. And so I want to make sure that everybody fully understands what electric ready really is. And basically what you're doing for electric ready is you are allowing a building to choose between gas and electric equipment. But if they do choose to go with gas, you are preparing it so that it will be an easier transition into moving to electric equipment. So that's going to entail things like wiring, panel, space. And then you have electric preferred. Now, electric preferred kind of goes a little bit above and beyond what you would find with the electric ready. Electric ready has all those items, but the other thing that it includes is really looking at and making sure that that gas appliance equipment is of a higher efficiency. And then, of course, the all electric or full electrification is where there really is no gas infrastructure that's being installed, and all of your appliances and equipment is our electric type. So those are I would say probably the 3 most thrown out types of terminology. Now, the state has determined what we are looking at is just the very basic, just that electric ready. And so because of that, they've created this language to assist with that. So how we're going to look at all of these sections, because I think it's really important when something is this new, is to see what the actual verbiage is. And so as you can see on the screen, it's giving us information about the scoping, when and where this applies, and how do we deal with some of the extra items, and then how do we determine whether we're exempt from some of these items. And then we'll take a look at kind of a, there's a lot of words there, but then we'll do a condensed, probably a more easily ready, readable version of what we see on the screen the first time. So this is letting us know that if you're a new building, or you're an addition, or you're a tenant finish, you will be required to comply with these provisions. So it also talks about when you are that first tenant finish, because remember, a tenant finish is when, you kind of have that core and shell, and then you have your very first tenant that goes in there. And this is when it's required. After that, it's not to that extent, right? Because then you're considered a remodel or an alteration after that. It does talk about that you will have to have additional electric infrastructure that needs to comply with it, but there are some exceptions. And as you can see, we've got the 3 exceptions here. So basically what it's telling us is if you are new construction and addition, you're that first tenant going into the space, you're going to be required to comply with the provisions that we find in here. Now, it also talks about that we've got to have electric infrastructure in place where we have those gas appliances, but it also talks about, hey, we have some exceptions to that. And that is, some of them is, which I think a lot of people are concerned about, are like fireplaces and fire pits. Those are not required to have the electrification ready. And then if you're doing additions, but you're not adding any new heating or cooling equipment, you are exempt from having to do this, right? Because the idea of it is that we're future proofing. If you're doing an addition and you're adding mechanical equipment, at that point, you would have to install the electric ready provisions, but otherwise you're just basically, you still kind of, not to use a term that we all probably hate, but you're kind of grandfathered in to what was existing. So we know that size does matter, right? A building that, is 100,000 square feet utilizes and has equipment that's going to be different than if you're this 1,000 square foot coffee shop, right? So the board understood that for these types of provisions, we had to take into account the size of the building. So they broke it up into 2 categories. And the 2 categories, that defining number is that 10,000 square feet. So if you're 10,000 feet or square feet or less than 10,000 square feet, you're going to follow one set of provisions. And then if you're 10,000 square feet or larger, then you're going to follow a different set of provisions. So we're going to look at the less than 10,000 square feet provisions and see where it says. So now we're talking about for our combustion equipment. It tells us, we've got to have a dedicated branch circuit that's sized to accommodate future equipment or appliances and serve a comparable capacity to meet the heating load. So the idea is if we have this gas appliance here, and it's going to do 100,000 BTUs, that we have electric equipment that could be swapped out basically to be installed in place of, and it still meets that capacity. But when they start talking about the capacity, it's not necessarily, the capacity to, heat the space. It's the capacity of the system that's involved to heat the space. And that's what they're kind of looking at with this. It's got to have an electric receptacle or junction box. It's got to meet various requirements for that. And when combustion equipment is used for space or water heating, there also has to be dedicated space for future electric equipment that can be installed for that. Now, there is an exception to that, and that is for when you start talking about dedicated space. That's where the exception is for. And that's so that if you already have like an air conditioning unit and you've got a space outside where that air conditioning unit is going to be located, you don't have to do an additional space, because the idea is you already kind of have a space. If you are removing that equipment, you can then place the outdoor heat pump in that location. That's kind of the thought process behind this exception. So as you can see, this, I think, makes it a little bit easier to look at. Your combustion equipment has to have a phased branch circuit, has to be sized for the future. You've got to have that receptacle and junction box, and all of that is going to need to comply with 302.5, which we haven't hit yet. And then it has to be connected to a panel, and there has to be access to a dedicated space for any future equipment. And that means that there can't be any obstructions to that, right? And that means obstructions not only to that equipment, but to that receptacle or junction box, right? Because I think we've all had that issue. Who put that there? And the idea is we don't want to have the conversation of who put that there. That's a useless spot. We can't ever get to that, right? So that's kind of the idea of what they're trying to accommodate here. Now, we talked a little bit about what that particular kind of leading to the panel idea is. And so there is some very specific information. And I know this is a lot of verbiage on the screen. So we're going to go to the probably more digestible information. I hope it's more digestible. So basically, you're going to be required to have a space reserved in the panel, or spaces reserved in the panel for future electric equipment or appliances. And that space has to have a minimum of a 2 or 3 pole circuit breaker attached to it, or associated with it. The breakers need to be sized to meet that future electrical demand of the equipment or an appliance. And I know a lot of people have asked me when I've taught this in other locations, how do we determine that? And I think most electrical engineers, because remember, we're talking commercial, most of the electrical engineers can do a pretty good educated guess, in my opinion, and are able to accommodate that to, the best that ability that you really can, because you don't know what future needs are going to be, but it is there. You are going to have to make sure that that junction box or that receptacle and the dedicated circuit breaker and in the panel, they all have to be labeled, and it all has to be labeled for future use. And that way everybody knows, oh, this receptacle, this junction box, whatever the case may be, this is for future electric equipment. And then obviously also in the panel, it has to be listed, right? We need to know that it's got to be at least, safe for that particular deal. Now, the next two bullet points there talks about the location of that receptacle or junction box and where it needs to be located within a distance of that combustion equipment. So if you happen to be non-HVAC equipment, so you have a gas stove, so you're trying to do the junction box and you're getting it all ready for a potential electric stove, that receptacle or junction box has to be within 3 feet of that gas stove. And then, of course, it has to have the dedicated space for it, has to be labeled and so forth. Now, if you happen to be HVAC equipment, you're still required to have, all that other various information, but you have to have that junction box or the receptacle within 6 feet of the combustion equipment. and the thought process is, the idea is, and I think we've all understood that, you know, the plug for the gas stove is probably a little bit shorter than the plug for the HVAC equipment. So I know that that was one of the discussions that they did have quite a bit of. And then, of course, they do have a note in there, a section in there that says discharge of condensate drainage must be provided. It does not give you specifics for that, and there's a reason for that, right? Because we need to follow what the requirements are for condensate drains for the, you know, per the IBC and the IMC. So they did take that into account. Okay. Now if that's for the smaller building. So now we're going to take a look at what the requirements are if you happen to be a building that's 10,000 square feet or larger. This one does also contain an exception. And the exception is the R occupancies. Now, I don't want anybody to get sick. You remember it said on here, I'm going to move back here really quick. It said here, when it's required is if you are less than 10,000 square feet and all R occupancies of any size. So because it's required to follow those provisions, they made sure to have R occupancies exempted from the 10,000 square feet or larger. So you could be 1 million square feet hotel and you're not going to follow these provisions. You're going to follow the other provisions. So again, it does talk about for the combustion equipment, it has various items that you must provide. You have to have access to it. You have to have the electrical panel must have that dedicated for future equipment. It also has to have the same dedicated space that you would find for that space or water heating. Now, when we talk about the electrical panel on this, it's very, very similar to what we saw with that 10,000 feet. You still have to have where it's a 2-pole or 3-pole circuit breaker. It has to be reserved for that future equipment. It needs to be sized with the idea that whatever that future electric equipment has to be able to meet the demand of what would be there for the future. You've got to have the space. It's got to be labeled. And then again, we also have to have dedicated space that must be provided for the additional equipment. Now, if you remember, let's take a look at this really quick. For the physical space in the smaller buildings, it didn't have all of these requirements, but in this one, it does include things such as transformers, cabinets, anything that's going to be needed for when we have projects that are this big, and we're going to have to comply with that. Now, just like with all of the codes, it does have some very specific provisions to it as to when and where and how are inspections supposed to really happen. So if we go into 104.2.3, it gives us basically, these are the items that we have to verify on plans and follow and verify that from the plans and do the inspections to. So for electric ready, it talks about we need to know the branch circuits, conduit or raceways have been, provided. They've also been properly labeled, and they're in the location that they were specified on the plans and per the code. Make sure that there is that reserved physical space, that's connected or within conjunction of where the gas appliance is, right? And that probably needs to be very heavily stated on the plans. That's what the intent of this space is, because I don't know about all of you, I'm pretty sure I've walked into a house maybe that, or even a storage unit that was supposed to be dedicated, and all of a sudden it became a storage unit, right? So the idea is obviously the space is dedicated just for that future equipment. Got to make sure that the panel has, all the requirements for it. The breaker is the correct type of breaker. It has the capacity that's needed, and that it's been labeled. And then, of course, you've got the final inspection. And this just needs to basically make sure at this point that everything has been labeled correctly at the end, right? We've got the label on the wall, basically, that this is receptacle is intended for this space is for that. So that's the required inspections that pertain to the electric ready components of the code. Now, I know that this is kind of a lot to take in. Do we have any questions concerning the electric ready provisions? Feel free to raise your hand or type it in there.
Looks like
Seems
we have a question for you, Hope.
Okay.
Will this code be required for entities that must meet state code requirements, for example, public schools? If so, when?
That is an excellent question. So as far as that would go right now, this code is only required if you are adopting newer codes after July 1st of this year. So basically anybody adopts newer codes now, you will be required to also adopt this language. So schools, I believe, have already adopted the 21 prior to the deadline for it. So when they do their next adoption, it will be required at that point. I hope that answers the question.
I believe it does. And then there's also a couple chats. Seems like space is the requirement, not actual wire breakers. So space and adequate conduit seems like would be compliant, which is my understanding as well.
Yeah, and if you see here, all it's asking for is basically that you're reserving a space in that panel that potentially can hold that, and that you've sized it as much as you possibly can. Now it does, when you talk about, oh, I'm so sorry, the conduit, it does talk about that you have to have depending on which one, that you do have to have things like a junction box, and you have that the wiring and the conduit that could potentially be there, because the idea is what they want to do is either they're taking the plate off and adding the actual receptacle in there, so then it is really then a plug and play type of deal, or the receptacle is already there, it's just not finalized on the other end. So it's not that you necessarily have to have the breaker there. You do have to have the space and the ability that the breaker would be able to go in there, because I mean the reality is we're not really sure, are we going to need a 40 amp breaker or a 400 amp breaker, right? I know I am exaggerating, but
all good. All right, got another question for you.
Okay.
If there are gas boilers that are requiring these electric ready provisions, can the location of the gas boiler be used as the space for future electrical equipment, or does it require an entirely separate area? So there is essentially empty space where the electric boiler will go, and once it's installed, the gas boiler would be an empty space.
Yeah, I think that that's an excellent question. And I know that was something that was discussed by the board. And from my understanding is you would have that you're holding a space for that equipment. And then it could be maybe incorporated with the electric boiler too, but basically they're saying they're not, how do I want to put this? Confident that the space that's there, they want a separate dedicated space for it. Basically, that's the roundabout of it. Now, and I would have to go back and look at what they're considering their commentary for it, but I believe they do want a dedicated space. So yes, you're looking at, you got a space dedicated until that electric boiler goes in, and then when the electric boiler goes in, now you have this other space that's dedicated to. I think that may be one of those questions that we may have to talk to the state board about. You know, they're very open, and, you know, it always happens that, you know, you do your best that you can, and you know that things are going to switch around. There's no way around it, right? You have every intention. You think about every possible situation that could potentially happen. And then somebody says, well, did you think of this? And you're like, even though we had a room full of people thinking about every possible possibility that could happen, no, that was the one thing we didn't think of. So
A fair point. Hit hope.
Yeah.
I think the other thing is, like, you know, sometimes it's the existing like, say, gas boiler might be used as a backup system or something along those lines. And so in that case, they would probably lean towards having a separate electric ready area. But
Yeah.
you know, it's worth asking that question too.
Absolutely, because there are some occupancies that are required to have backup equipment. And so because of that, that may be in those particular situations, that may be the case. So, all right, well, let's move on through, because I know we are having great discussions and I love it. So let's talk about our Solar Ready. So Solar Ready, you are required to have a Solar Ready zone unless you fall into some of the parameters that you find on the screen. And the biggest one was, you don't really need a Solar Ready zone if you are already installing a permanently installed on-site renewable system. And so I know that some of the concerns was to, quote unquote, get out of this exception. They would throw one panel up there and then call it good, saying they've complied with it. So they did set up some very specific parameters saying that, you know, it's got to cover 40% of the net roof area, and that it has to meet certain parameters. It also talks about if the shading, if 70% of the daylight hours you live in shade, it doesn't make any sense to have the Solar Ready zones, right? And then where there's a licensed design professional that certifies that they cannot meet this requirement because there are some very specific parameters, right? You've got rooftop equipment, skylights, you know, vegetative roof area, or, you know, any other type of obstructions. You know, you might have something like a laboratory that has all this venting going on and so forth. And so then maybe you may not be able to have that because it's a special type of building with very specific parameters. The Solar Ready just may not be plausible. And so they did take that into account when they were developing this language. So let's talk a little bit about some of this. So one is, for your Solar Ready zone area, you have to have at least 40% of your roof area, needs to contain the Solar Ready zone. Now, it does take into account for things such as, you know, skylights. If part of that space is your roof deck, or you have vegetative roof areas, or there's certain times and locations where there's mandatory access. We all know about that, right? There are specific items out of the fire code that say, hey, you've got to have this space available for access. And then sometimes you also have to have access for other requirements. So it does say that 40% is kind of that remaining items. Now it also talks about, and I think this is the most important component, in my opinion, of this design, is that you cannot have any obstructions in this space that you are dedicating on your plans. Nothing can be in that area. You can't have any plumbing vents, any piping whatsoever, any type of vents, any duct work, any HVAC equipment, skylights or roof mounted equipment can't be in that. Well, it's going to be a 2-for-1 type deal, right? It's going to take care of that solar ready zone, and it's also going to house this stuff. It's not. You have to have, basically, you're going to have a very blank slate up on that roof. And I'm not talking about a slate roof. I just mean a blank space on that roof. So if we talk about the roof area here, typically,
Hope.
Oh yeah.
Could I ask you a quick question?
Oh, please do.
On the topic of obstructions, so are you aware of any code requirements which prevent new construction or additions from shading neighbors' existing solar panels or solar ready zones?
I would say not at this moment am I aware of it, but the 24 is coming out. I'm not saying it's in there. I'm just saying, at least currently, I am not aware of any.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So we got 50% here. Most of the time people think that, okay, so here's about 40% of that 50%. That's what we're going to call our solar ready zone. And that's not really how we need to look at it. And I'm giving you this insight. So let's pretend like this area is 1,000 square feet. Now we know that this building is required to have skylights. They have to have at least 3% skylights. So now we're at 50 square feet of that roof area is skylights. We also know that it contains a portion that's an occupied roof. So 200 feet of that, square feet of that is occupied roof. And then it also has to have a vegetative roof. So we have those parameters. Then we got to think about, we also have to include in this design the setback requirements. So now, if we take that 1,000 square feet, which is what we started off with, we subtract this 50 square feet, which is our skylights, the 200 for the occupied roof, the 200 for the vegetative roof, the 100 for the fire code setbacks. That gives us 450 feet that we're working with. And that 450 feet, if we take 40% of it, that gives us 180 square feet. So instead of what we were looking at before here, right, that whole side of the building, now we're looking at, this is the area, the 40% of the roof area that really is the component that needs to be provided for. So I know a lot of times people think that, oh my gosh, my roof is going to be covered with panels, and nothing says you can't cover your roof with panels, right? Offset, great idea. But what this section is requiring is the fact that it's 40% minus those particular items, because we know that skylights are in there and occupied roofs are, part of it, and vegetative roofs are part of it. And then you've got setbacks. So it's 40% of what's remaining then needs to be set aside for that solar ready zone. So it's ready to go, whatever the case may be. Now, just like with the electrification, we have to think about that we've got to have a space in the panel that is there to accommodate for that. So we want to make sure that the panel has not only the future electric ready, it also has a space for future solar. There also has to be an interconnected pathway. So it has to go from the panel and to wherever it's going to. And then we also have the understanding, or there needs to be an understanding, which I think I call this out a lot, is the fact that you also have to show that the roof has been designed for that increase of that dead load, right? So we got to make sure that the roof is designed to be able to just basically plug and play, right? They can just take those panels, slap them on the roof, and call it good without having to go through the structural, design. Can it be done? Can it be done? What else do I have to do to make sure to get those panels in there? The idea is, right, that it's future proof. It's already good to go. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about that panel and making sure that there is a space, and it also talks about where it has to be placed. It talks about that it has to have, or that the main electrical panel has to have at least a 200 amps. Oh, and I guess this one doesn't talk about where it has to be placed. Oh yeah, it does. The has to be positioned at the opposite end from that input feeder. So I wanted to make sure that everybody was fully aware of that. Now, if you remember earlier, we talked about when you aren't required to have it. And I think this might be a little bit of what you're referring to, Erica, right? We've got our two large buildings that are basically shading the smaller building. So if this smaller building had been there first, there's nothing, I believe, that stops those other two buildings from being as tall as they are. But if it's this smaller building that's getting built in between those two, they're not required to have the space, or they're not required to have the dedicated solar ready zone, but they are required to have the electrical panel space reserved for it. And then when we talk about, I know we're running out of time, so I apologize. When we start talking about inspections, there is a section again that's going to give you what are the required inspections when we're talking about, basically at, for plan review, and what we're getting at like the rough inspection, and then what you need to look at for that final inspection. So it does provide those particular provisions. So that is the solar ready. If you noticed with it, it probably didn't look all that unfamiliar. While it is not the appendix for the solar ready appendix that is in the current IECC and has been for many editions, it was kind of based off of that, just taking into account of some of Colorado conditions. So it's very, very similar. Not exact, but it is very, very similar. All right, let's talk about electric ready and when it comes to our commercial buildings. So basically, if you are a new building going in, or you're an addition, and you are, or a major renovation, at that point, you are required to comply with the provisions that we're going to talk about here. It does have some very, very specific definitions to define it, because there are a lot of different categories that they have in here for the electric vehicle ready. Oh, maybe. I'm not sure. You may be absolutely correct on that. So in this particular section, they have a very specific number of required spaces that have to meet one of the four categories. And they have four categories, which is the EVSE, which is the electric vehicle service equipment, EV ready spaces, EV capable, and then EV capable light spaces. So we have four different categories of spaces that do need to be complied with. And again, there is somewhat of specific information when it pertains to an R2 occupancy. And what you see on the screen basically says, hey, if you're an R2 occupancy, as defined in Chapter 3 of the IBC, you will be required to follow the R2 occupancy requirements for that. So we're going to start going from the very the equipment's already installed all the way down to capable light. So the first one that we're talking about is the DCFC, and don't we all love all of the abbreviations? And if I didn't have the definition on the screen, how many of you know what a DCFC is? Yeah, well, Adam, you would know. So I want to make sure that you'll notice that, you know, it does talk about definitions, and you'll see on here every time there's a new term, I have the definition up there. So it's very, I hope, easier to understand. So DCFC is talking about the direct current fast charger for the electric vehicle service equipment, if I remember correct. And so for this, it talks about that you have the following options. If you are required to have 100 spaces, you're going to do 110 or whatever the case may be. This gives you a little bit of flexibility if you're not an R2. If you want to put in more of this type of equipment, all of your extras up to a certain point, you get to count that towards some of the other categories that are required. And I'll explain that a little bit more later. And they have the same option for the R2s. It's just reduced drastically about how many of the actual installed equipment you can reduce down to the other ones. So basically what they're saying here is, if you had a minimum of it's required for you to have 7 spaces, and you say, hey, I'm going to install 10 spaces. That means you have 3 that you can do the next category down for. And what that does is, you know, it kind of allows you some flexibility, or I don't know if flexibility is the right word, maybe bonus for the fact that you're going to go above and beyond what you'll find within the table. And so here's an example of the table. And as you can see here, it does tell you how many of each space is required. And they, for the most part, it's all based off of percentages. And it also is also based off of the number of spaces that are going into that parking space. So we have capable light, and capable light is basically the least of the least amounts that you can do. And we just need to have that raceway or conduit. You got to have you know, the panel space. It's got to terminate within 3 feet of where the EV capable light space, it needs to be capped. Anytime we have any type of future equipment, right? It's got to be capped off. We got to make sure, excuse me, that they're noted. We have the physical space to accommodate for the equipment. So we can't just have it out there, say, hey, there's my capable light equipment or space, and then have it piled up with everything else. There's got to be that dedicated space that in the future it's going to be there. Here's the definition for the capable space. And basically this one does have that raceway and conduit. It needs to be between that electrical panel or whatever the electrical distribution equipment is going to be. And then it needs to terminate within 3 feet of where that EV charging space is going to be. And then it also has to be capped. You can use it for 2 adjacent spaces, right? Because we've seen that. I think I showed a picture of it where you've got 1 set of equipment and 2 chargers for each space that can be utilized at each space. And that is acceptable per the language there. You do have to make sure that there is at least a 40 amp rated circuit. The electrical panel has to have that dedicated space. You also have to have that termination point of where that conduit and raceway is. We've got to have for future use of the equipment. Not sure how that'll be labeled, but I'm sure we'll all figure out a way to make it so it's readily available. And then we have to make sure that the reserved capacity cannot be any less than the 8.3 kVA for each of the EV capable spaces. If we're doing EV ready, it means that you're going to have it terminate at the receptacle or junction box. It needs to again be within 3 feet of the space. It again can do both. And that this one has the I believe it has the junction box or the receptacle instead of just having it capped off, right? It has the space basically that all they have to do is either plug the equipment in or take the plate off, add the plug and plug the equipment in. That's basically what they're looking at for the EV ready space. And then it has a lot of the other requirements, right? Market for future use. Now the electric vehicle, supplies equipment, not service equipment, supply equipment. This is basically where you are installing that equipment. It's there. You've got the plug. Everybody can pull in, charge their vehicle, and that's what this particular category of that table is talking about. And so this has some very distinctive requirements, and one is that you have to, on number one, you have to meet one of the following, either A or B. And what I want you to take a look at is, B is that it's Energy Star certified or has the ability to connect to the internet. So there are some additional items that would kind of fall into play, that it's not just, plug the equipment in. And then this, of course, is that it has been installed. Now, the thing we all need to realize, and I think we probably all do realize, is there are some minimum charging rates that have to be available for it. And the other component is, when we talk about parking, we all know that we also have to accommodate for accessibility. And so because of that, it does take into account not only accessibility, it also takes into account the NEC, because the NEC has very specific requirements when you're talking about electric vehicle charging, correct, Adam? Right? I'm good. There are some specific sections that you would have to comply with. And so instead of trying to duplicate it, right, all they say is, hey, you know what? We know accessibility is a requirement. Go over to Chapter 11 of the IBC. Hey, we know that there are provisions in the NEC. Go over to the NEC and address those. You need to comply with those. The other thing is, you have to identify certain aspects on your construction documents, designate where all of these locations or all of these specific categories are going to be located. Where and making sure that it's documented on the plans. And I know you can't see it on the plans very well there. And clearly make sure that all of that information saying, hey, this has to be placed in the various components within the project itself. And then of course we have the required inspections that you find in 104.2 to let us know what is it that I need to go out and inspect for when we're looking at this type of information. So I see that we had a question. What is the purpose of having the charging system connected to the internet? You know what, to be honest, I'm not sure why that could potentially be the reasoning for it. I'm sure that there is somebody within the electric vehicle industry that may have reasons as to why that's considered like the upper echelon of everything, but I could not give you that information.
Sometimes electrical AV charger also will say you can it'll notify you when it's done charging, for example.
There we go. So you're not wasting the charge or the space. So
yeah, something along those.
There we go. See, we're a team here. And I know we went over, so I appreciate everybody, jumping on. It was a great discussion. on this, and I know it's a lot of information to try to comprehend of what the requirements are. So feel free to reach out anytime. We've got the helpline. Lots of people ask us questions about this through the helpline. So
Yeah, definitely. Thanks so much, Hope. And thank you everyone for joining. This has been a great presentation. And if you guys would like to hear more about the residential side, come and join us next week. Same time, same place. So hope to see you there.